On April 19, 1991, around 1 in the afternoon, David Hibbs arrived at his house eager to tell his mother, Joy Hibbs, that he had made the honor roll on his report card. Unfortunately, instead of finding his family house in Corydon, Pennsylvania the way he had left it, he returned to find it in a smoke-filled state. David ran to the back kitchen door after noticing that his mother's car was in the driveway, but heavy smoke stopped him from going through. David somehow managed to observe that the 4 gas stove burners were all lit up. At his young age, the only logical reason to what must have caused the fire was that his mother had been cooking and had forgotten to put out the fire. A helpless David yelled for assistance in panic. He was heard by neighbors doing yard work, and they tried to go in to find Joy Hibbs, but the fire was too fierce. They immediately called the firefighters. Before the firefighters arrived, as the fire increased and burned endlessly, the neighbors tried to put it out with a garden hose. After what seemed like a lifetime, the fire was finally put out by the firefighters, and a paramedic sadly informed 10-year-old David that his mother had passed away. The body of 36-year-old Joy Hibbs was found by the firefighters in David's bedroom. She had been burnt beyond recognition on the remains of David's mattress. Initially, detectives thought Joy Hibbs had perished in an accidental fire, but an autopsy revealed otherwise. There was no indication that Joy had inhaled smoke, thus it was obvious that she had already passed away before the fire was started. Also, Joy Hibbs had been brutally assaulted, strangled with wire cords, and then stabbed 5 times in the chest and neck before her attacker purposefully started the fire to hide every iota of evidence at the scene. This was a clever cover-up approach by the killer, given that the house had been completely destroyed from the fire, and that the neighbors had destroyed important evidence while attempting to put out the fire. According to the findings of the fire marshal's investigation, the fire originated from 4 different locations in the home: 2 in the kitchen, 1 in David's bedroom, and 1 in the corridor. According to the investigators, the morning of her death, Joy had cashed her paycheck. Her purse's contents were tossed on the living room floor, and the police found her wallet stuffed under the couch. The absence of evidence was compounded by the difficulty the investigators experienced in determining a motive. Joy was adored by all, worked part-time as a medical assistant, and was committed to her family. David Hibbs described his mother as graceful, polite, and easygoing. Authorities had no leads whatsoever as to the person who would want to kill her. On the day she was killed, Joy had dropped her 2 kids off at school in the morning. She received her paycheck, ran a few errands, and got home shortly after 11 o'clock in the morning. A church pastor and another member of the congregation dropped by for a visit shortly after she returned home. Joy Hibbs had indicated a desire to celebrate Easter in the church. Just before noon, the pastor and a member of the church departed the Hibbs family house. According to eyewitnesses, there was a dark blue Monte Carlo parked across the Hibbs yard shortly after the church pastor and his member left. The car was said to have remained there until 1 p.m. 2 days after Joy Hibbs' murder, former Bristol County Police Chief Tommy Mills, who was also a narcotics detective, reached out to the residence of Robert Francis Atkins in Falls, Pennsylvania. Robert lived about 2 hours away from where Joy Hibbs lived. Joy and her husband would occasionally buy tiny amounts of marijuana from Robert Atkins, who also appeared to have been their former neighbor. Robert resisted letting the detectives into his house. In the driveway, Detective Tommy Mills spotted a dark-colored Monte Carlo that matched a witness's description of a similar vehicle parked carelessly outside Joy's house shortly before the neighborhood heard the fire. However, during further investigation, the witness said Robert Atkins' automobile wasn't the one they saw. Robert Atkins was invited to undergo a polygraph by the investigators, but he refused, explaining that he had damaged his arm and that his lawyer had instructed him to wait since the nerve damage would affect the polygraph results. He further disclosed that he was camping at the Poconos with his family, friends, and co-workers when Joy's murder took place. Detectives soon verified his alibi. Robert confirmed that he bought a little marijuana for the Hibbs, but he wasn't a dealer. In the weeks preceding his mother's murder, David Hibbs overheard her arguing with Robert Atkins on the phone over the most recent purchase of a baggie of marijuana. Because the baggie was packed with stems and seeds, Joy demanded her money back from Robert. When asked by the police, Robert confirmed these arguments. He, however, stated that he had informed Joy that he couldn't refund her the money. According to him, it was simply improper. Investigators couldn't understand how a few tiny baggies of marijuana could cause someone to die. The couple was only spending $20 to $40 on marijuana at a time, not enough to get the attention of major sellers. On April 27, 1991, a co-worker of April Atkins, the wife of Robert Atkins, came forward to say that on the day Joy Hibbs was murdered, she had called the Atkins residence between 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m., and Robert Atkins had picked up the call. On hearing this, the police now thought Joy's murder took place between 11:50 and 12:50. The police turned their attention to Joy's private life after determining that Robert Atkins' alibi appeared to be flawless. They questioned Joy's relatives and friends and found nothing unusual. Except for the person who had killed Joy, no one seemed to harbor any wicked intentions for her. Robert Atkins was still a person of interest in the case, despite having an alibi, though. 23 years after Joy was brutally murdered, a new Bristol Township detective, Michael Slaughter, was assigned the cold case in April 2014. Detective Slaughter made the decision to visit April Atkins, who claimed that she had never been questioned by authorities regarding the death of Joy Hibbs. She, however, clung to the narrative that her family was on vacation in the Poconos that weekend and hadn't learned of Joy's murder until they returned. A few days later, Detective Slaughter re-interrogated Robert Atkins regarding his movements at the time of Joy's death. He supported his wife's account of going camping and revealed to Slaughter that he had been a secret narcotics informant in 1991, doing drug deals and then reporting them to the police. During an interview with Slaughter in May 2014, a co-worker of Joy claimed that on the Monday before she was killed, a man called Joy at work and threatened to kill her. The co-worker decided not to report the call to the police because Joy's husband was now the focus of the investigation at the time. 2 years later, in September 2016, April Atkins, who is now divorced, traveled to the Bristol Township Police Station in order to provide a taped statement regarding her ex-husband's whereabouts during the murder of Joy Hibbs. Detective Slaughter was informed by April that Robert Atkins had returned home covered in blood after allegedly stabbing someone and setting their home on fire. He then instructed her to gather the children, take a few days off work, and travel to the Poconos in the north. Out of anxiety and fear, April remained silent. That day, Robert Atkins took a shower after washing his blood-stained clothing. April Atkins didn't find out about Joy Hibbs' murder until after the family had returned from the Poconos. Even with this revelation, nothing significant occurred in Joy Hibbs' case for the next 5 years until November 2021, when Bucks County Detective David Hanks located a former co-worker of April Atkins back in 1991. The co-worker initially denied knowing April, but after the DA subpoenaed her to testify before a grand jury over the phone call she had made to the Atkins house, she changed her story. When he was supposed to be camping at the Poconos, Robert Atkins answered the phone call. The following month, Detective Hanks caught a conversation between Robert Atkins and his ex-wife, April, on tape. Robert was led to believe that April had informed her roommate of his involvement in the murder of Joy Hibbs. Naturally, this raised Robert Atkins' blood pressure. Also, his son testified in court in April 2022 that his father had informed him in December that he was likely going to be arrested soon for something that had occurred many years earlier. Robert first mentioned that a woman had died in a fire to his son before mentioning that she had been stabbed. Finally, 31 years after killing Joy Hibbs, Robert Atkins was arrested in May 2022. He is presently being held at the Bucks County Correctional Facility and faces charges of first and second-degree murder, 7 counts of arson, 2 counts of robbery, and 7 counts of first-degree arson in relation to the death of Joy Hibbs.
In the last days of 1973, Debra Curb was a 17-year-old student at Fresno High School. Her friends and teachers described her as a cheerful and outstanding student. On December 31, 1973, Debra hosted a small get-together inside her family's residence located on the 4000 block of College Avenue in Fresno, California, while her parents were away in Pismo. To welcome the new year, Debra Curb and her friends, which included her boyfriend and another couple, engaged in puzzle solving while listening to music. When the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of the year 1974, the small party ended and the young host bid her friends farewell. Tragically, Debra would only have a little glimpse of a potentially fruitful year. On January 1, 1974, in the late afternoon, Debra's parents came back home to find her lying dead with her own leotard wrapped around her neck. When the tragedy was reported to the police, an investigation into the case was launched, and detectives started looking into persons who had last seen Debra alive, specifically those who had attended her party hours earlier. A young man named James Arthur Blaylock, who was 17 years old at the time, was quickly suspected by authorities. James was one of the party attendants and had come along with his girlfriend to the gathering. He was said to have driven the others home when they left Debra's residence. Authorities believed that James Blaylock might have committed the murder. They were of the opinion that he had gone back to the Curb family home, using a spare key he had known the location of to get inside and rape and kill Debra. Unfortunately, though, that was only a theory. There was no concrete proof to convict James for the crime. In 1974, due to a lack of supporting forensic equipment, detectives were unable to prove what they so firmly felt to be true: the fact that 17-year-old James Blaylock was a deadly killer. The Debra Curb's case, however, slowly became cold. Many years later, in 2006, the Fresno County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation and attempted to run some of the biological evidence collected from the crime scene through recently developed DNA technology. This time, there was a success. James Blaylock's DNA matched the sexual assault kit. To further confirm this, Debra Curb's body was also exhumed in 2006 so that a DNA sample from her could be obtained. The samples were then submitted to the Serological Research Institute, a non-profit forensic lab in California that soon confirmed James Blaylock as the culprit investigators have been looking for all these years. James Blaylock, who was incarcerated at the time, was subsequently interviewed by Fresno County Sheriff's detectives Marty Rivera and Jeff Kurtzen. He denied killing Debra and having sex with her. Blaylock soon changed his account after the detectives confronted him with a DNA match of his semen. He claimed he and Debra had consensual sex but never killed her. The case was brought by the district attorney's office, but it had to be dropped for lack of supporting evidence. The case went cold again for another 15 years. In December 2021, Sergio Toscano, a current cold case detective and former Fresno County Sheriff's officer, revisited the Debra Curb's case and asked for a repeat DNA test on the leotard used to strangle Debra. James Blaylock's DNA results were obtained again. His DNA was confirmed on the sexual assault kit and also appeared on the leotard. After this discovery, in 2023 detectives tried to get in touch with James Blaylock, but they soon learned that he had died in the hospital in 2022. He was 66 years old at the time. Blaylock had a significant criminal history over the course of his lifetime, which included violent crimes and becoming a registered sex offender.
In June 1980, Holly Ann Campiglia, a native of New Jersey, vanished following a period of poor mental health. Holly had been battling with mental issues since high school, but she became increasingly erratic when she got to college. One fateful day, on her way to a counseling appointment, she jumped out of her mother's car and was never seen again. All her family knew at the time was that she hitchhiked to Sacramento. After sending her family one letter, Holly stopped contacting them. Immediately after her disappearance, her parents, Augustine and Sally Campiglia, reported her missing, but unknowingly to them, her name was accidentally removed from the National Missing Persons Database. Meanwhile, in August 1980, the body of a 21-year-old woman was discovered in a cornfield off Seavers Road in Dixon, not far from the location of the current Pedrick produce market. She was dressed in a green wool sweater despite the summer heat and had been shot in the head numerous times. Detectives at the time had no idea that the woman's name had unintentionally been erased from the National Missing People database just 2 weeks prior. The victim and her murderer could not be identified, and so she was dubbed Dixon Jane Doe for 12 years. In 1992, when Augustine and Sally Campiglia got to know that their daughter, Holly Ann Campiglia, had accidentally dropped from the missing persons database used by law enforcement, they contacted the officials to re-add her name into the database. 5 weeks later, the Campiglias were informed by Solano County detectives that they had a match. Holly Ann was their Dixon Jane Doe. This was heartbreaking news for Holly's family. In an interview, her mother, Sally, sadly said, "I just kept hoping she would show up one day with grandchildren, but with each year, I'd lose a little hope." Even though Holly Ann could now be laid to rest properly, neither her family nor the police knew what had happened to her. The investigation was abandoned until 2021, when Holly Ann's relatives contacted the police to inquire about the possibility of using modern forensic methods to identify Holly Ann's killer. Investigators got to work, and a male's DNA was found after evidence samples at the crime scene were sent for testing. In 2023, investigators from the Solano County Sheriff's Office declared that they think the DNA belongs to Herman Lee Hobbs, who is currently 76 years old and serving a sentence at a prison in Chowchilla. According to research, Herman Lee Hobbs had been a violent criminal throughout his adult life. In 1969, when he was 22 years old, he was accused of carrying out more than a dozen armed robberies across the Sacramento region. Hobbs admitted to being the serial robber and consented to plead guilty after leading police on a wild car chase. However, when it was time for his sentence, the 6'5" mechanic attempted to flee the courthouse and had to be tackled and subdued by a CHP officer. Herman Lee Hobbs' time behind bars for armed robbery was brief. He was back on the streets by 1975. He relocated to Rio Linda, a street away from Terry Pata, a 13-year-old junior high school student. One day in January 1975, Terry Pata was sent home from school early due to her having nausea and a headache. She, however, never made it home. 9 days later, her body was discovered nearby, placed inside a drain pipe. She had been raped and fatally stabbed. At the time, no suspect was ever found. Years of sexual assault by Herman Lee Hobbs weren't made public until 2000. He was convicted of raping a 15-year-old girl in Yuba County that year. When Hobbs was taken into prison, his niece and daughter came forward to express concerns that he might be responsible for the deaths of numerous children. This tip led investigators to Terry Pata's long-suppressed murder. When DNA from Terry Pata's crime scene was examined, it matched Hobbs. Hobbs, who was already serving a lengthy jail sentence for rape, pled not guilty to Terry Pata's murder and was given a further 25 years to life sentence. This was just the start. That same year, some loggers discovered a woman's skull in the Yuba County foothills. Through DNA testing, the remains were identified as 29 years old Brenda Ann Tucker, who vanished from her house in the area of Oroville in 1994. Hobbs was known to Brenda Tucker's loved ones. In the 1990s, he had occasionally even stayed at their home. Hobbs was accused of killing Tucker, but a court eventually dropped the charges in 2002 owing to a lack of proof. In 2023, after his DNA was a match to the DNA at Holly Ann Campilia's crime scene, Solano County investigators had Hobbs moved to the Justice Center detention facility in Fairfield. He is being charged with first-degree murder. According to the Solano County Sheriff's Office, investigators are collaborating with other organizations in Northern California to find any additional potential victims of Herman Lee Hobbs.
In the early hours of January 3, 1991, when the Seaside Police arrived at Sabato Park, they discovered the body of Vicki Johnson, a 34-year-old mother of 3 lying on the sand on the playground. The police couldn't believe the sight before them. Vicki had suffered a very horrible death right in the park. She had been strangled and suffocated. Her upper torso, which held part of her clothing, was set on fire, and she had a significant amount of sand lodged down her throat, as if her head had been held in the sand. Vicki also had bite marks from the attacker all over her body, and her clothes were torn. Her murder was so brutal that it left the community of Seaside in shock for many years. Due to the crack epidemic and the high crime rate at the time, Seaside was known as a violent community. That reputation was only strengthened by Vicki Johnson's brutal murder. Her case remained cold for almost 4 decades after investigators exhausted all possible leads. In 2021, Vicki's case was reopened by the Monterey County District Attorney's Office when the Cold Case Task Force was launched. After providing additional evidence to the California Department of Justice for DNA testing, investigators were able to identify a suspect in connection with the murder after 2 years of thorough testing. Thanks to the DNA sample taken from Vicki's fingernails, authorities were able to identify her killer as Frank Louis McClure, after entering the DNA into CODIS. Apparently, McClure left significant DNA underneath Vicki's fingernails while she struggled and fought vigorously for her life. Frank Louis McClure, who had lived all his life in Seaside, had a long list of crimes in his history book. His criminal history dates back to 1990 and includes assault, causing serious bodily harm, and resisting law enforcement. McClure broke the terms of his probation in 1994 by engaging in domestic violence and an assault with a deadly weapon. He received a 4-year prison term afterwards. From 1991 to 2011, Frank Louis McClure committed numerous crimes involving domestic violence and assault. He received little time in prison and was, however, never charged for murder. It is unknown whether McClure and Vicki were romantically involved. The motive of her murder is still unknown and probably will remain a mystery since Frank Louis McClure died at the age of 77 in 2021 in his seaside home. Regardless, Vicki Johnson's family is grateful that the murder has been solved.
On September 28, 1979, 3 visitors who were out day tripping in Sugar Pine Point State Park called a local news reporter to report finding a body at a picnic area on Lake Tahoe's western coast in California. When the cops showed up, they discovered a terrifying situation. There laid a woman who had been battered and strangled to death. A lost shoe and numerous indications of prior battles suggested the woman had been pursued across the campground before her assailant caught up with her. Detectives assumed that she was most likely a solo traveler because there was no indication of her car or of any other possessions that would have served as identification. Despite the collection of forensic evidence, including a sexual assault kit from the crime scene, the case gradually became cold since neither the murder victim nor her possible killer could be identified. The young woman was reluctantly buried by the authorities in a simple grave with the sign, "Unidentified Female." Many years later in 2015, the El Dorado County Cold Case Homicide Unit made the decision to re-examine the long-dead Jane Doe and provided local Jewish newspapers with images of a particular religious jewelry she had been wearing when she was discovered. This appeared to have been a great move because the daughter of the victim reached out to the police after she recognized the jewelry. A DNA test was conducted, and the victim was identified as Patricia Carnahan through a DNA match to her now 61-year-old daughter. Patricia Carnahan was 35 years old when she vanished while traveling throughout California in a red Volkswagen minibus in September 1979. Earlier that month, she had let her family know she was returning home, but after a month of not returning, Patricia's family in Virginia had reported her missing. Even though her Volkswagen was later found abandoned at a car dealership in Venice, California at the time, there were still no leads as to Patricia Carnahan's whereabouts. After her identity has been verified, authorities returned Patricia Carnahan's body to her family for a proper burial. Investigators were now left with catching Patricia's killer. After investigators tested the DNA on a discarded beer bottle that was discovered near where Patricia Carnahan was found, it matched the male DNA found on her body during autopsy. The 3 men who reported finding a body in 1979 were then tested for a DNA match, but they were immediately excluded as their DNA didn't match the one at the crime scene. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile of the suspect into CODIS, but there was no match at the time. In 2022, in order to deal with the state's backlog of testing rape kits, the Washington State Attorney General's office launched the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Project. Since 1981, the Spokane Police Department has maintained over 1,500 untested kits on hand, some of which were used in a rape investigation involving a man named Harold Carpenter in 1994. A homeless Spokane lady alleged that Harold Carpenter had physically and sexually abused her in April 1994. At the time, Carpenter was arrested and placed into the Spokane County Jail on a charge of second-degree rape. The case was, however, suspended after it was determined to be unprovable, and no official charges were ever filed. The rape kit was nevertheless saved as evidence. After the rape victim's kit was turned in for DNA testing in August 2022, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab notified Spokane Police Department detectives in early February 2023 that the DNA from the 1994 rape kit is connected not only to the DNA in CODIS, but also to the 1979 murder of Patricia Carnahan in El Dorado County, which was a cold case at the time. Based on this evidence, in 2023, investigators from El Dorado County arrived in Spokane to help the Spokane Police Department arrest Harold Carpenter. After his arrest, investigators soon learned that Carpenter had been involved in a handful of misdemeanors over the years, ranging from burglary, sexual assaults, disturbing the peace, possession of drugs, reckless driving, driving under the influence, among many others. However, he was never suspected of killing Patricia Carnahan. He either got away with his crimes or served a minimum time behind bars. Carpenter made his first court appearance in Spokane in March 2023. He remains jailed in lieu of $1 million bail.